The neon rain hissed against the chrome canyons of Lumen Row, turning the street into a lacework of light and liquid. The city breathed in fluorescent sighs, exhaled in electric aftertastes of ozone and hot coffee. Between silvered storefronts, a fissure of shadow crawled along the pavement, a fault line of reality, splitting the world like a fault in a glass pane. The moment Mara Calder stepped into the breach, she felt the air throb with two possible futures, humming in counterpoint one, where she kept her head down, the other where she punched the horizon and hoped the sky wouldn't blame her. She was a time smuggler by trade and by necessity, a collector of passages that allowed bodies and goods to slip between eras as easily as slipping a coin into a jukebox. The drift, that delicate, dangerous corridor through which moments can be traded, bought, refashioned, was not a place for saints. It was a market with a velvet rope and a price tag written in the language of chance. And Mara paid that price with something far more valuable than credits: memory, risk, a portion of her own future she could ill afford to lose. The river of neon stretched into the distance, a river that didn't flow so much as it launched, leaping between the buildings and curving around the heads of those who walked beneath it. Mara's boots tapped a steady rhythm on the pavement, a metronome for a mind that wouldn't stop turning over the same coins again and again. She wore a coat of stubborn midnight, the cuffs frayed like the edges of old map paper. On her wrist, a band of clockwork rings, the last memento from a home she'd left behind for reasons she could no longer fully recall, reasons that grew fuzzier with every time she forced herself to choose. The breath she exhaled fogged in the rain, and the fog itself braided with a second breath somewhere to her left, a breath that belonged to him, though she tried not to think about him. Time, as everyone said, was a circle with a jagged edge. Mara liked to tell herself she was cutting a new edge, not circling the same stubborn blade. The paradox gate, the thing she hunted, then fled from, then hunted again, stood where the street met a dead-end alley, wide enough for a cart, but narrow enough to keep out the truly honest. It was a thing no one could own, only borrow or steal, an artifact of a century that hadn't decided whether it wanted to be the past or the present or the future. It hummed with an ultraviolet glow that crawled along the rain-slick bricks and stitched everything into a tapestry of possible times. Mara did not approach it with bravado. Bravery never aged well in a market where every decision could cost you a memory or a future you hadn't earned yet. She stepped into the glow, felt the ordinary world throb and tremble, and then the edge of the world whispered away. The alley chose for her. The world she emerged into wasn't the one she remembered leaving behind. The neon still sprawled like a map that refused to lie down, but the map's lines moved beneath the ink, rearranging themselves in response to the steps she took. The paradox gate pulsed at the end of the alley, a heartbeat in light. People moved through the street as if the ground had shifted slightly underfoot, as if gravity had decided to sample new weights just for the thrill of it. The air tasted like copper and rain and something sweet you could almost believe belonged to memory itself. "Nice trick," a voice said from behind her, calm and precise, like a tool being set down after a careful cut. She turned to see a man stepping from the shimmer of a holographic storefront that didn't exist in the meager sense of reality. Not yet. He wore a long coat of gunmetal blue, tailored to look like a promise more than a garment, and his eyes carried the kind of patience that comes from watching every possible breath before it happens. He introduced himself with a small bow of his head, the gesture neither mocking nor respectful, but truly interesting, as if he was thinking about him and her and all the other possible versions of this moment, all at once. "The name's Cale Voss," he said, and the attraction to his voice was exactly the kind of error Mara's life had learned to avoid. The word, Cale, itself seemed to hum a different frequency in this street, as though the name carried a different resonance on another timeline, one where the syllables wobble and tilt, a reflection of a different you. Truth has a way of finding me in the wrong times, Mara replied, which was the closest thing she'd say to a threat or a courtesy. The truth, of course, rarely wore a name the same way twice. Cale studied her with the sort of cool calculation the street had not yet learned to fear. You're Mara Calder. You call yourself an artisan of the drift. You're currently the most wanted person in a city that doesn't quite exist in the same way for many people. Nice to meet you, Mara returned, a smile flickering across her face that wasn't a source of warmth so much as a challenge. What is your business with me, detective? The term detective hung in the air between them, Cale's official identity, a title that carried a weight of inevitability in a place where inevitability was merely another path you could drift along if you learned to ride the ripples. The word also highlighted a private irony. In a world where history could be rewritten, moral lines often blurred into dark, quick shapes. Cale's gaze did not waver. He looked through Mara, as if he'd once seen her through a lens that didn't exist anymore. A lens that could have prevented this moment or forced it. Your name is a map, Mara. You move through time like someone's personal weather. You are here because someone wants the helix key you carry. And because time itself has started to cough up its secrets in your vicinity. The helix key, Mara repeated, her throat tightening around the familiarity of the phrase. The device wasn't a thing you could point to, exactly. It was a concept a man or woman could cradle in their fists, with fear and hope braided together. A paradox's heart, a key that could unlock or lock a future, depending on who used it and when. And the moment you found yourself facing a man who could see your potential futures as if he were reading from a stack of clear plastic pages, you realized you were in trouble, not because you didn't know the right move, but because you did, and your brain kept trying to pretend you didn't. Cale stepped closer, a mere breath between them. The air sizzled with static that tasted metallic and sweet, a scent that carried the memory of something Mara had never had and couldn't name. What is it you want? Mara asked, not because she needed permission to ask, but because she needed to hear the opposite of what she believed was true. The drift taught you to question every certainty until the question itself lost all meaning, and you found yourself in a room where you forgot your own name and still recognized the price of a mistake. Cale's lips quirked in the ghost of a smile. We want the same thing, in a different way, Mara. We want to stop the paradox from collapsing both our timelines into a single, hollow future. We want to protect our own memories and the futures we might not even know exist yet. We want to do something that feels impossible and not fatal. He paused, as if listening to the rain that didn't fall. We want a third way. The phrase hung in the air, a phrase every hunter had whispered at the edge of a kill. A phrase every soldier had whispered before the world changed its mind about them. The helix key, the thing both wanted and feared, pulsed faintly in Mara's palm. A living weight that answered to the rhythm of her pulse. A sudden shimmer blossomed along the alley's edge as a door appeared where there had been only wall. A doorway sized for two and a heartbeat longer, framed in ribbons of refracted glass. The door opened onto a space that did not feel like a room, so much as a memory trying to become real again. A corridor of light that led to a place Mara could glimpse, only as a shadow of a dream. Cale stepped through without hesitation. Mara hesitated, as she often did when the choice seemed to demand more courage than she'd kept in reserve for a lifetime of small, dangerous decisions. Then she followed him. The door sealed behind them with a sigh of pressure and a scent of rain on metal. The room beyond was a sort of temporal cockpit, all glass panels and softly whirring engines. A place that could have been a laboratory, or a sanctuary, or a ship's bridge, and perhaps a combination of all three. The air carried a familiar, almost intoxicating, hum like the moment just before a thunderstorm, when the wind shifts, and the electricity in the air makes your own skin lean towards the possibility of danger. Cale moved to a console along one wall, where a holographic map blossomed into view. A map of times, not places, with nodes blinking in patterns that resembled stills from a beastly film. The Helix key sat on the console, its coiled metal glinting with an inner light that seemed to pulse to its own private tempo. The paradox, Cale began, his voice careful, isn't just about two timelines colliding. It's about what you're willing to give up in order to force a new order. He gestured toward the map. You want a future that doesn't erase the past. But every attempt to stabilize a paradox risks erasing an entire branch of what could be, even a future you haven't lived yet. Mara stepped closer, furiously resisting the urge to retreat to the safer edges of the world she knew. Explain it in small words, detective. I don't have time for philosophy. Cale's eyes softened, not with pity, but with something like shared ache. When you stabilize a paradox, you anchor the current event into a single memory. The others, the countless versions of what could have happened, fade away. It's not just the present that vanishes. It's the future that would have sprouted from those possibilities. Collapsed into the single path you chose, Mara pressed a hand to her stomach, where a familiar ache lived, the ache of a decision that would shape the rest of her days, if not the rest of her life. And if I don't stabilize? Cale's mouth pressed into a line. Then the paradox remains, unanchored. The two times fight to become one, in a street that won't stop bleeding light. The city becomes a palimpsest, erasing one history while writing another, and neither you nor I will recognize the world we wake to tomorrow. A weight settled in Mara's chest, a quiet, stubborn stubbornness that had kept her afloat through years of risk and loneliness. She had never believed in the idea of a third way, always urging her own choices toward a black or white horizon where consequences could be weighed and measured, or at least named, so she could decide whether to run or to stay and fight. The drift had taught her better than that. Life was a network of tiny compromises, each decision a thread that could knot or unravel an entire mortality. Show me, she said finally. The word "a blade of iron." Cale stepped closer to the console, guiding her to a seat that faced the map. The Helix key shivered, a living creature that seemed to breathe as if it existed in a time before breath. He tapped a sequence into the panel, and the map shifted. The nodes rearranged, the lines weaving into a new geometry that suggested a kind of bridge from one timeline to another, one that wouldn't erase either, but would require an enormous price to be paid. The third way, Kyle whispered, as if afraid to wake it, is a path through memory itself. It would require you to relinquish something you hold most dear. Your home, Mara. Not the building or the land, but the memory you tell yourself is your source of belonging, your map to where you come from. Stabilize and you keep the now. You risk losing the home that anchors your soul. The words struck Mara as if she'd been struck by a sudden wind, a force she hadn't counted on and hadn't prepared for. She had always measured distance by time, but memory was a different dimension, a room inside her head that could be visited and revisited with a policy if you could pay the price. Tell me what becomes of me, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. If I give that up, who am I? The same person who is here now, Cale said, his calm voice almost a lullaby in the hum of the engines. But the you that remains remembers nothing of who you used to be, the future you would have built, gone. The only thing left would be the you who stands here. And you would live in a world that is supposed to be yours, only you won't recognize it as yours. Mara looked into the glassy surface of the console where the two timelines smeared into a single reflection, two versions of herself, both tired, both not quite real. She thought of the salt glass quay on her homeworld, how the salt air never lied, how the harbor kept its secrets in the dark, how the memory of the quay could be enough to carry a person through any storm. If she lost that memory entirely, would she still know herself? Would her decisions still carry weight if the memory of why she'd chosen them was gone? The door where they had entered the dimension that did not quite belong to any era popped softly, as if a bubble were bursting and reforming in the same breath. A voice crackled across the room, static and sweet, like a memory you suddenly remember you had forgotten. Cale, we've got trouble. The voice belonged to a woman Mara recognized, not from life, but from a rumor she'd traded stories about in the drift. A rival smuggler who moved through paradoxes with a grace that looked almost peaceful, an eerie calm that could only come from someone who'd already learned to live with consequences that would crush any ordinary person. The door hissed again as if in warning, and then it widened, revealing a figure standing at the threshold. It was a young woman with eyes that shimmered with 1,000 clockwork halos and hair like a night sky broken into stars. The woman wore a coat that looked at once expensive and abandoned, as if it had walked from one time to the next and refused to stay still. Lyra, Mara whispered, a name that tasted like the last time she'd spoken it, and the first time she'd ever thought of Lyra from the drift. But this was not the Lyra she had known in the past, not the one who'd sold her a paradoxed future. This was a version of Lyra from a different thread of the same fabric, one that wore authority like a crown, and wore fear like a cloak, that could be shed when it was safe. The woman's eyes flicked toward Mara, with an expression of calm, almost maternal, as if she were gliding through a danger she could see, but not touch. Lyra? Mara's voice had become a phrase in a language she didn't speak often enough to trust. Lyra, you shouldn't be here. You know what this means. Lyra made no answer, but stepped inside and closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like the closing of a latch on a not-yet-born door. She moved with the grace of someone who could vanish into a timeline and leave the shadow of it behind for others to interpret. Cale looked from Mara to Lyra, a history of rivalries written in the steady line of his lips. Lyra chose this path once before, he said. She knows what it costs to navigate paradoxes without fate's permission. Lyra reached the console and studied the helix key with the careful, almost ceremonial attention of someone who had performed this act long enough to forget what fear felt like. Then she looked up at Mara with eyes that seemed to know more than they should. Cale, you promised me a future, Lyra said, her voice cool, but carrying a note of urgency that made the air feel as if the rain were about to fall again, even though no rain touched the neon air. You told me the drift was a business, not a grievance. But times have changed. The archivists have shifted. They're watching you both now, and they're not interested in who wins the argument. Mara felt a prickle at the base of her skull, the old sensation that came with being watched by people who could not be trusted to keep their promises. Your future was never truly yours if someone else chose it for you. The drift had taught her the rule of all-powerful debts. Someone else always pays the price. What do they want? Mara asked, her voice a little louder than necessary. A shield she could use to startle the world into paying attention. Lyra's mouth curved in the barest hint of a smile, one that suggested neither triumph nor despair, but something like resolve. They want to see what you'll sacrifice to save yourself. They want to know if there is a third path, or if you're all ready to surrender to a future that's already decided by someone else. Cale's gaze narrowed, the lines of his face hardening with a quiet, determined resolve. We are not surrendering, he said, stepping closer to the helix key. We are choosing carefully. Lyra turned and regarded Mara with a fixed, almost clinical interest. You have a hone you remember with a salt-stung memory. Don't you, Mara? A memory of a coastline where your heartbeat matched the tide. If you give up that memory, you'll be free to live in a future you haven't imagined yet. But you'll be alone in it, not because you want to be, but because there won't be a version of you that remembers what they left behind. The room seemed to tilt a fraction, the walls bending as if the gravity of the conversation could alter physics. The paradox, which had begun as a whispered rumor in the drift, had opened its eye and was looking at them directly, as if to demand an accounting for every breath they took, every choice they made, every time they chose themselves over someone else. Mara closed her eyes for a moment, not out of fear, but out of necessity. She pictured the salt glass key, the way the wind came in off the ocean, like a slow, patient rumor, the way the gulls cried in a language older than the city, the way the water tasted of salt and secrets. Home was a memory she could still recall with clarity, a harbor of quiet in a life that had learned to be loud so it would not be ignored. If she lost that memory, if she chose the third way, what would be left of her? If she chose the paradox's stabilization, would she become someone entirely new, a version of herself who could hold a future without the anchor of a past? Lyra's eyes softened for just a fraction of a second, then hardened again. You'll have to decide soon, Mara. The second you decide to stabilize, the future you're trying to save will begin to erase itself. Not in a day, but in a breath. The longer you delay, the more you entwine yourself with a fate you'll never recover. The urgency in Lyra's words wasn't a threat, Mara realized. It was a warning from a different timeline, one where the archivists had already decided the outcomes and were merely waiting for the right moment to press play. "Show me the third way," Mara said, surprising herself with the evenness in her voice. The word wasn't a vow, it was a dare. Cale nodded slowly. "If we're to gamble, we gamble together." Lyra's expression barely changed, but there was the tiniest tilt of her jaw, a sign of approval, or perhaps resignation. She turned to the map, touching a finger to a node that pulsed with a pale, almost spectral light. The map responded with a series of delicate shimmering lines, forming a pathway that wasn't a route but a risk, an invitation to step into a future that hadn't earned the right to exist yet. "Where does it end?" Mara asked, though she knew the answer would be less a place than a consequence. Cale's reply was quiet, as if he were speaking to the room's shadows rather than to Mara. "It ends where all paradoxes end, with choice. Either anchor a single moment and accept what it costs, or leave the moment unanchored and watch time rearrange itself around you. The third way asks for both, a stitching of paths that should not meet, a bridge between a home you remember and a future you have never lived." The room grew suddenly colder, as a new presence, an intelligence not human in origin, or not wholly human, made itself felt. It was as if the paradox gate itself exhaled onto the room, reminding them that a system's memory was also a system's vulnerability. The Cathedral of Time, as some in the Drift called places like this, wasn't a church, but a clockwork temple, where every bell toll cost mercy. "Cale," the voice said in a tone that had learned to be gentle only through centuries of listening, not through kindness. "Lyra, if you go forward with this, you must understand the price is not just personal. The third path demands a sacrifice to the future you will not live to see. Are you prepared to bear that weight?" The question did not surprise Mara any more than the rain or the color of the neon did. It had always existed, in the periphery of every choice she had ever made. A reminder that the road forward, as bright as it might be, did not come free. "Let's do it," Mara said. Not loudly, but with a clarity that startled her. She stepped toward the console, toward the helix key, toward the future and the memory she might lose to secure it. The danger felt less like a trap, and more like a door that had finally opened, when she'd believed it would forever remain closed. Lyra studied her for a moment, then gave a small, almost respectful nod. "Then we proceed. The third way will demand more from you than you expect, Mara Calder. It will demand trust in a shared risk and the courage to walk through an opening that might vanish behind you once you step forward." The word trust stuck in Mara's mind as if it had become a foreign currency she had to exchange with the universe. She wasn't sure she had enough of it left to give, but she did have something else. She had a memory of home, and whether she remembered her home or not 15 minutes from now would be less important than whether she could remember a purpose big enough to justify taking the risk of losing it. The trio moved into a single line, and the room's hum swelled in their chests like the sound of a landing craft. The path to the third way glowed, a thread of light that dipped and rose with the cadence of a heartbeat. The helix key thrummed in Mara's grasp, a pulse that grew steadier as she prepared to leap. The moment they stepped onto the path, the room condensed around them, And the two timelines, Mara's in the present, and the version in Kale's mind that had lived through what could have been, tugged at each other with the gravity of a world's memory ending and beginning again. They crossed into the stitching of time. The world snapped into a new focus, as if someone had twisted the dial on a lens, and suddenly all the edges sharpened into their most dangerous possible form. The Paradox Gate hung above their heads, turning the alley into a stage where reality forgot which act it was supposed to perform. The street, which had always carried with it the soft murmur of rain, carried now something heavier charged particles, a scent of ozone, and something sweet that belonged to a future Mara could almost taste on her tongue. Kale's voice was in her ear, even though his mouth was not moving, a kind of telepathic broadcast. A side effect of their shared vulnerability to the paradox. We go slow, we go together, we do not run, not yet. We watch for the first sign that the knot we're trying to tie cannot be tied without fraying the rope. Mara's hand tightened around the helix key. She glanced at Lyra, who offered nothing but a quiet nod, a sign that she too understood the gravity of what they intended, an act of will that could unmake the entire history of a girl who had already lived through too many unmade futures. The path of the third way unfurled before them, like a map drawn by a child who had learned geometry from the stars. They stepped forward into the unknown. The city, two cities at once, two times layered upon each other like paper cutouts, tilted and reassembled itself. A sound like glass cracking under a heavy boot ran through the street, and in a breath the crack mended, stitching the edges together with a careful, almost tender warmth. The helix key's glow intensified, then pulsed and shifted in Mara's grip. The warmth at her chest changed to a cold, then a heat that reminded her of the sun that used to rise over the salt glass quay when it was cold enough to see your breath in your own eyes. She could feel something inside her, the sense that something essential, something she had believed she could never do without, was about to be taken away. Now, Kale whispered, his voice a thread that seemed both present and a memory of a different future. We hold the line between two truths. We anchor this third way in a moment that has not yet occurred by forcing it to become a moment that already exists in the minds of those who would bear witness to it. Lyra's hand landed lightly on Mara's shoulder, a touch both reassuring and devastating. The memory of home surged through Mara with the force of a tide. The harbor, the way the wind from the sea carried with it whispers of a life she hadn't yet dared to dream, the sense that somewhere out there, a future waiting to be chosen was quietly calling her name. In that moment, Mara understood something essential about human memory and time. The mind held not just the past, but also the future, and the future, when offered as a choice, could be chosen with the same stubborn courage one offered to the past. If the memory of home could be relinquished, the person Mara would become would not be erased. Instead, she would become someone who could consciously decide which past to carry, which present to inhabit, and which future to build. The weight of that realization filled her with a fierce kind of clarity she hadn't expected to feel again in this lifetime. The three of them formed a triangle of beings who had learned in different ways to live with risk. They projected their focus toward the helix key, toward the knot they were trying to tie in a world that kept asking them to cut their own threads. The gate's hum intensified, a chorus of time itself leaning forward to listen to what they would do next. Then a ripple ran through the street, a series of circular tremors that ran along the pavement like dropped pebbles in a still pool. The ripple grew into a wave, and it wasn't water the wave carried, but time. It rolled forward, dragging the two timelines with it, splitting and healing as if time itself were a living thing, learning to forgive. It was both a collision and a lullaby, both a question and a decision. The paradox's two futures, one where Mara had chosen to run, and the other where she chose to stand and fight, merged with the newly chosen third path, a thread of possibility that had not existed a breath before. Helix key thrummed with something like a heartbeat that wasn't exactly hers and not exactly Kale's or Lyra's, but a joint chorus now. A memory being carved into the fabric of a world that would remember this moment. In that moment, The memory that Mara most feared losing pressed against her chest, with a longing she could not quite name. It was not a memory of a place, but a memory of belonging, a feeling that she had always belonged somewhere, even when she'd told herself she never would again. Home was not simply a harbor or a quay. It was a sense that one's own life fit into the universe like a piece in a jigsaw puzzle that had been created for her before she existed. The third way did not erase all futures. Instead, it braided them together into a singular, shimmering thread that allowed many possible lives to share the space of a single moment. It did not give them a perfect past or a flawless future, but it gave them a chance to choose in the present the kind of history they would inhabit and pass on to those who would come after them. The cost, they all knew, would not show itself immediately. It would show itself in the long, quiet years that would follow, in the way memory changed shape, in the way a voice would recall an event that never happened the same way twice, in the way a small detail would become a pillar of a life, and in the way a person might forget the very reason they began to fight in the first place. The ripple slowed, as if time itself had decided to rest for a moment in order to take stock of the outcome. The city's two skies, the one that belonged to the older, softer past, and the one that belonged to the sharper, more electric present, settled into a third, more delicate balance. The soundscape adjusted. The rain no longer fell but hovered in an almost tangible form, a fine mist that clung to hair and clothes, in a way that felt almost reverent. Mara's breath steadied. She looked at Cale and Lyra, and for the first time, she saw in their faces something rarer than victory, a quiet, grown thing, a shared consequence that felt less like a tragedy and more like a vow. "We'll do it," she said, the words coming out with unusual certainty. "We'll do the third way, and we'll pay what must be paid. But this is our choice. It belongs to us now, not to the archivists and not to any future that would take our names and erase them from the list of possible outcomes." Cale inclined his head, a gesture that could have meant gratitude or acknowledgement or both. Lyra's eyes softened again. That same somber kindness there, the sense that she too had chosen the same path, if not for herself, then for the people she would watch who had no choice but to move forward. The helix key gave a final, almost affectionate glow, and then settled into a calm that felt like the eye of a storm. The three of them stood together, a compact of risk and resolve, as the last tremor of the old time finally ceased to shake them. The paradox gate dimmed to a pale shimmer, the boundary between the two realities thinning not into a crack, but into a mere suggestion of what had been and what could be. A hush fell over the street, a stillness that was both relief and awareness. The neon's glow did not vanish. It found a new coloration, a hue that suggested not a victory but a balance, a world in which memory and time could be engaged in a more honest way. The city's hum settled into a cadence that sounded like a hard-won peace. Mara lowered her gaze to the ground, not out of humiliation, but out of a moment of honest reflection. The price would be paid, yes, but the price would not be paid in ignorance. They would remember what they could, and what they could not, they would learn to live with. The memory of home would remain, but it would not define her anymore. It would be a compass that pointed toward a future she and others could share without fear of losing themselves in the process. She looked up again and met Cale's steady gaze. "What now?" Cale's answer was simple and strange. "Now we walk into the world we've made. We see what it will become, not what it must erase. We test the third way's promise with every breath we take." Lyra stepped closer, her presence a steadying gravity in a place that no longer demanded fear. "The archivists will not allow this to stand without a response," she said softly. "They will watch and wait, and they will test us. If we mean to keep this third path intact, we will need to be ready to defend it, not only with force, but with truth." Mara felt the weight of her future in the palm of her hand. In the glow of the helix key, a warmth that promised both danger and something else she had long forgotten, hope. The door to the temporal rune opened behind them with the same soft sigh as before. and a breeze, not of wind, but of possibility, blew into the chamber, lifting the memory's tangled threads and guiding them toward a new dawn. She stepped toward the threshold of their new reality, a place that would require constant attention and constant courage. The street outside was still neon and rain, but it was no longer a battlefield. It was a playground, a field of potential that could be shaped into something worth fighting for. Two timelines were still there, yes, in the background of the city's life, but they no longer pressed down on the present like a wave that could drown a town. They existed as part of a larger tapestry, a number of threads intertwined, but not wound so tightly that one pulled would ruin them all. Cale walked with Mara to the street's edge, Lyra at their side, a triangle of people shaped by risk, but also by something else. A sense that they were no longer chasing a future dictated by someone else's design, but were participating in the design themselves, a task that required a daily practice of courage and a willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of their choices. The city sounds stretched into a calm there, the clink of a glass, the soft rolling of a vehicle's engine, the distant hiss of rain against metal. The neon signs flickered, then steadied, in colors that felt less like advertisement and more like a message to the mind and heart. We are here. We can choose. We are not alone in the risk of becoming. The drift, that old, dangerous market of possible times, had a new edge now, not sharp with the threat of loss, but edged with the possibility of a future that could be remembered with dignity. Mara found herself thinking about the memory of home again, but this time with a differing awareness. Memory did not have to be a chain that bound her. It could be a beacon that guided her to new shores. The home she treasured did not disappear. It shifted, rearranged into something that could exist within the present, something she could carry forward not as a weight, but as a map. In the days that followed, the three of them, Mara, Cale, Lyra, found themselves crossing paths less as enemies and more as colleagues who had learned to believe in a shared possibility. The archivists, those patient observers of time's long theater, watched but did not yet intervene with the force they were known to compel when necessary. They were not done with Mara and her friends. In the drift, there is no end to a story as long as there is the breath to begin another. The city's nightlife persisted, though it wore a new grin, a knotted happiness that could only exist because the fear of the infinite had loosened a notch. Mara learned to walk down Lumen Row without glancing over her shoulder at the future that might still be chasing her. Because she understood that a future would only chase you if you ran from it. And running was no longer the only option. There was a third way, a way that required the courage to stay, to face what you had chosen, and to take responsibility for the life you would build from its consequences. Time drifted more gently, as if the paradox had learned to temper itself around the three of them, and perhaps around the city itself, which had always deserved to be treated like something alive, something that deserved respect and care, not fear and reckless experimentation. On a quiet evening a few weeks later, Marin Calder, the name she still wore, even when it no longer defined who she was as clearly as it once had, stood at the edge of a balcony overlooking a street that had settled into that rare and beautiful stillness that comes after a storm. The skyline blurred into itself, the lines between times softened, and for the first time in a long time, she felt no need to run. She felt instead a deep kinship with Cale and Lyra, with the memory of home that would never disappear entirely, with the third way they had created, a way that did not erase the possibility of a future, but allowed them to bring the past along with them as they stepped forward. It was enough for now. It was enough to know that the timeline's ripples had changed something essential. Not the world's fate, but the people who would shape it. From the street below, a banner-lit sign flickered into view, its letters a little blurred by rain and the city's hum. And Mara found herself smiling, a quiet, almost wicked smile, the kind you wear when you've learned to outsmart the worst of your own designs. The sign read in glowing, dancing letters, "Enjoyed this timeline twist. Subscribe, like, comment, and share for more futures." The line felt odd, almost an intrusion into the world's intimate moment of quiet transformation. But Mara realized absently, delightedly, that rhythm of a future audible to the heart, only when it remembered the price of hope. If someone asked her about it later, she would tell them what she told no one else during the nights when fear still clung to the corners of the city. You cannot choose what life will present you. You can only choose whether you will step into it with your eyes open, and whether you'll bring what you love most with you when you do. And that is what Mara Calder did. The two skies above Lumen Row blurred again, as if time itself stretched to inspect what had just happened. The rupture closed in on itself, the street's neon sighing back into something like a memory of rain. Adrift's currency began to shift in value, no longer a price paid in fear, but a price paid in courage, the courage to accept that memory and future could be braided into a single living thread. In the end, the paradox did not vanish from the world the way a flame might snuff and be gone. It remained, not as a weapon, but as a mirror, a reminder of who they were, who they could still become, and how, between two possible lives, the one they left behind and the one they dared to claim, stood a fragile human bridge. They stood on it, and they walked forward. The neon night stretched high above them, a ceiling of light and possibility, and Mara did not know what tomorrow would bring. Exactly. She only knew three truths with the quiet certainty that comes after a battle won without victory. After a choice made that wasn't a triumph over an enemy, but a commitment to a shared future. The home she hadn't realized she'd needed would always exist in some form, even if its shape changed. The future wasn't a fixed point, but a place you organize with your companions, with memory as a tool and courage as a guide. The third way could hold a universe of moments without erasing them, stitching memory and future into a shared heartbeat. She laid a hand against her chest, feeling the pulse where the helix key slept in its hidden cradle, quiet now, but always listening for their next move. Then she looked at Kale and Lyra with a new respect, a recognition that they were still in this fight together, and that the fight was not against a clock or a gate, but against the fear of what comes after the revelation, that reality is not a single line, but a living braid of lines, each one worth protecting, each one worth saving. Outside, the city exhaled once more, the rain washing the neon dust from the streets and leaving behind a clean, unsettled glow. The future, that strange, unwieldy thing, awaited them, not as a battlefield, but as a doorway. They stepped toward it, not running, not waiting, but walking with their heads held high, ready to face whatever came next, together. And somewhere in the distance, a chorus of machine voices began to chant something like a lullaby. Something like a call to arms, something like a promise. The drift would continue, the archivists would watch, and the city would endure. So would they. They had chosen, they had paid the price. They had made something new, and the neon street, that thrumming vein of possibility, kept beating. It kept offering, gently now, a future that could be touched with the fingertips, a future that might remember them when they were long gone. The fourth moon rose, the rain settled into a mist, and the city's heart beat with a calm, stubborn rhythm. A reminder that human beings were not simply passengers of time, but pilots of a more hopeful, more carefully built horizon. The end of one story was the beginning of another. But this time, they would write it together. The narrative, their narrative, had found a third way, and it felt, for the first time in a very long time, like home.